A German shepherd stands alone in the snow, her fur soaked, her eyes pleading. Clutched gently in her mouth is her dying pup. She doesn't bark, she doesn't run, she just stares at the door of a stranger's house. As if she knows that inside lives her last hope. Why did she come here? Why didn't she give up like the world did on her? Watch till the end. This story will restore your faith in grace and show you how sometimes God's miracles come wrapped in fur. The wind clawed at the windows of the ground floor apartment like a beast desperate to come in. Outside, Havenport had all but disappeared beneath a blizzard, its sidewalks buried, its traffic lights blinking uselessly in the white. Inside apartment 1B, the world was hushed. Ezra Callan sat in a threadbare recliner, the same chair he had sunk into for almost 3 winters now, a heavy wool blanket across his lap, and a cooling cup of chamomile on the side table. The fireplace flickered in the corner, but the warmth never seemed to reach all the way in. Neither did the silence feel peaceful. It was the kind that echoed, the kind that remembered. Ezra was a man of 45, though the grief carved into his face made him look older. His eyes, once quick and searching, were now slow and faded, a dull stormy gray behind smudged glasses. His black hair was going silver at the temples. A long-heeled limp in his right leg made his walk uneven. A quiet souvenir from the night, a truck skidded through a red light and took his wife and daughter, leaving him with nothing but a broken leg and a lifetime of questions. Since then, Ezra had retreated into a solitude so thick it felt like another layer of snow. He spoke to no one unless he had to. He kept his blinds half shut. The only constant in his life was routine and the silence. So, when the scratching started, faint and insistent beneath the roar of the storm, it took a moment for Ezra to realize it was real. He muted the television and waited. There it was again, soft, like fingernails on wood, or claws. Frowning, Ezra stood, wrapped his robe tighter, and shuffled toward the front door. The hallway beyond the door was unlit, only the glow of the street lamp outside casting pale shadows across the floor. He hesitated. It might be nothing. The wind sometimes made sounds like that, dragging tree branches across the windows or rattling the vents. But it came again, this time accompanied by a sound even more unlikely. A low, almost inaudible whine. Something was out there. He unlatched the door and opened it just a crack. The cold hit him like a slap. The wind rushed past him, trailing flakes of snow into the hallway, and for a moment all he could see was white. Then, as if carved out of the storm, a shape emerged, a dog. No, not just a dog, a German shepherd, her fur caked in snow and ice, standing with trembling legs on the threshold. Her eyes, amber and wide, were locked on Ezra's with a strange, piercing intensity. She said nothing, of course, but she didn't have to. In her mouth, clenched with careful desperation, was a bundle of fur. A puppy, limp and almost lifeless. The pup's tiny legs dangled, its eyes were closed. Snow had formed a crust along its spine. Ezra froze. The image struck him like thunder. A mother standing in the storm, holding her child, asking without words for a miracle. For a moment he couldn't move. Then, instinct, raw and sudden, kicked in. "Jesus," he whispered, dropping to his knees. "Come here. Come in." His voice was hoarse from disuse. Gently Ezra reached out, and the mother, after a second's hesitation, stepped forward and laid the pup into his arms. The puppy was cold. Too cold. Its body barely rose with breath. Ezra stood quickly, cradling the tiny thing to his chest, and motioned for the mother to follow. She limped, her right paw raw and red, but she followed him inside without a sound. Inside, he rushed to the fireplace, placing the pup on a soft fleece blanket beside the hearth. He knelt and began to rub the puppy's sides with a towel, hands shaking. "Don't you quit on me," he murmured, not knowing if he was speaking to the pup or to himself. The mother, tall, proud even in her battered state, sat close, never taking her eyes off the tiny form. Her ribs showed under her matted fur. Her ears were torn and the tips frozen. Her breath came hard. Yet her eyes, those eyes, were alive with something fierce. Ezra fetched another towel and draped it around her. The room began to fill with the damp scent of wet fur and the faint crackle of hope. Upstairs, Frank Delaney, Ezra's neighbor, peeked through his window. An old man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a mouth that never quite relaxed. Frank had always found Ezra odd, but harmless. A man with ghosts. Tonight, though, Frank had overheard something strange. He'd been walking down the hall earlier to collect a delivery when he passed a man in a dark coat speaking into a burner phone by the alley near the dumpsters. "She's out. The bitch is out. And she's not alone. If they find her and that pup, we're finished. Shut it down if you have to." Frank had paused, unseen in the shadows, letting the words stick like frost to his skin. He didn't know what it meant yet, but it had sent a chill through him deeper than the weather. Back downstairs, Ezra sat on the floor near the fire. He'd found a syringe and dropper in the back of his first aid kit, and was gently offering the pup a few drops of warm water. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, little one." The pup made no sound, but its chest moved, a flutter like a question. The mother let out a long breath and leaned closer, her nose brushing against Ezra's wrist. He didn't pull away. He looked at her. "Where did you come from?" he asked. No answer, of course. But behind her eyes, there was a story. He didn't know it yet. Not the cages. Not the months of forced breeding. Not the escape through freezing alleys. Not the man named Clive Denham who still searched for her, who'd lost money and patience and wasn't going to let either go without a fight. Ezra didn't know any of that, but he knew something. This mother had walked through hell to save her pup, and she'd come to his door. So he would not let them die here. Not in his house. Not this time. The storm outside raged through the early hours of morning, smothering the city in silence and snow. Inside apartment 1B, Havenport's bitter winds were forgotten for a while, replaced by the crackling of the fireplace and the rhythm of shallow breathing. The puppy, small enough to fit in one of Ezra's palms, lay nestled in a cocoon of fleece and towels, its frail chest rising and falling with effort. Ezra hadn't slept. He couldn't. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, watching the pup with the alertness of someone afraid that looking away might allow death to slip in unnoticed. In the dim firelight, his face looked drawn, hollow beneath his stubble, but his eyes were no longer dulled with grief. They were sharp, focused, alive. Orion, the mother, lay curled around her pup with the vigilance of something ancient. Though still limping and crusted with frozen mud, she barely moved, save for when the puppy let out the faintest squeak and she nudged it gently with her nose. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. But she watched, always. Ezra leaned in again with the dropper. He had boiled the water just warm enough, and now he whispered under his breath as he coaxed another few drops into the pup's mouth. "There you go, Nova. Just a little more." He didn't know where the name came from, only that when it had first escaped his lips, it felt right. A nova. A dying star that erupts into light. Maybe this one would choose not to die. When his phone buzzed, it startled him. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. His voice was dry. "Hello? Mr. Callan?" The voice on the other end was bright, young, professional, but gentle. "This is Maeve Santiago. I work with the Pinebrook Veterinary Clinic. You called earlier about an emergency?" Ezra cleared his throat. "Yeah, it's urgent. I've got a mother and her pup here. The little one's not doing well. I've been warming it, giving it water, but I don't know what else to do." Maeve was already grabbing her coat. "I'll be there in 15. Text me the address." At 23, Maeve Santiago was in the final year of her veterinary degree. Tall and lean with honey-colored skin, her dark curls were tied up in a messy bun, and her glasses sat low on her nose as she moved with practiced urgency. Maeve had a reputation at the clinic, not just for her skill, but for her stubborn empathy. She once chased a stray cat 4 blocks in the rain just to patch its leg. Her mentor often said she carried too much of the world on her shoulders. Maeve never argued. She had grown up in the foster system, shuffled from house to house, until she landed with an elderly animal rescuer who taught her how to treat wounded creatures. She'd promised that woman she'd pay it forward, and she had been doing so ever since. When Maeve arrived at the apartment building, the snow had buried the stoop nearly to her knees. She knocked gently and was greeted by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Ezra blinked at her, then stepped aside silently. The moment she saw the animals curled by the fire, Maeve dropped her bag and knelt down. "Okay, sweetheart," she murmured to Orion first, extending a hand slowly. I'm here to help your baby. Orion sniffed the newcomer, her nose twitching. Maeve held her breath. Then, slowly, the dog lowered her head again and allowed her near. Maeve examined Nova with clinical precision, gently running her fingers along the pup's limbs, checking for fractures, trauma, infection. You've done well, she told Ezra. This little one was minutes from slipping away, but you've bought her some time. Ezra didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded. Maeve continued, her brow furrowing as she checked Orion. She's older, maybe 7. Been through hell. This paw's infected. Scars here, here too. And this... Wait a second. Her fingers froze near the base of Orion's neck. She's chipped. Ezra's brow furrowed. Like, microchipped? Yeah. Maeve reached into her bag, pulled out a handheld scanner, and swept it over the area. It beeped softly. Bingo. Let's see who you used to belong to. She pulled out her tablet and plugged in the numbers. Her face changed as she read. Well, that's interesting. No registered owner, but the chip's linked to a holding facility outside of town. No adoption, no release date, just status. B23 female breeder. That's not a shelter, that's a kennel. Probably one of the illegal ones. Ezra felt his gut twist. You mean, she was bred for sale, Maeve said grimly, and when she wasn't profitable anymore, they probably dumped her. Or maybe she escaped. Orion shifted slightly as if she recognized the tension in their voices. Her eyes flicked to Ezra, then back to Maeve. Wait, Maeve leaned closer. This chip, it's still active. If someone's tracking it. They all turned to the door at the same time. On the other side of the city, a man sat in a dark van parked across from a convenience store. His name was Clive Denham, a man in his early 50s with a square jaw, black coat, and eyes like ice chips. He had the appearance of someone who kept himself neat for show, but had long since stopped caring about anything beneath the surface. Clive ran a pet supply chain that fronted for an underground dog breeding operation. Cheap, fast, brutal. Orion had been his best producing female until she broke free during a transport stop. Since then, he'd lost 4 buyers, 2 sponsors, and a lot of patience. Tonight, his tracker app beeped. The chip was active again, for the first time in 3 days. Well, well, Clive muttered. He tapped the screen and zoomed in. Hello, Havenport West. He made a call. The voice on the other end sounded bored. Yeah? She's pinged. West End. Apartments near Briar and 18th. Send someone to scout it. Quiet. If we lose her again, it's your job on the line. Got it. Clive hung up and lit a cigarette, staring through the windshield. You should have stayed where you were, girl, he whispered. Back at Ezra's, the air inside was thick with tension. Maeve looked up. We need to get her off that chip's radar. I have a scanner blocker in my van. It'll scramble the signal. Do it, Ezra said, already standing. Also, she added, we should file a report with the Animal Control Unit. If this is connected to what I think it is, it's bigger than just one dog. Ezra looked down at Nova, still curled but no longer limp, then at Orion, whose eyes, no longer sharp with fear, watched him calmly, trustingly. For the first time in 3 years, Ezra felt something he had thought gone forever. Responsibility. The fragile kind. The kind that asked you to fight for more than just survival. He nodded. Whatever you need, I'll help. Outside, the wind howled like something ancient, but inside, beneath the quiet flicker of the fire, a spark had begun to glow. Small, flickering, but real. Morning crept into Havenport slowly, filtered through thick curtains of fog and frost. The city was blanketed in snow, but the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a glassy hush. In apartment 1B, the fire had burned low, casting a dim orange glow over the living room, where 3 figures, 1 man and 2 dogs, remained suspended in quiet vigil. Ezra Callan sat cross-legged on the floor, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the bundle of fleece by the hearth. The puppy had not moved for hours. Its breaths had been shallow and infrequent, each one a fragile thread holding it to the world. Ezra didn't dare blink. And then it happened. The tiniest sound, a high-pitched whimper, barely louder than the rustle of fabric. Ezra leaned in, heart stuttering. The pup moved, or perhaps twitched, just once, a slight flex of its paw. It was more than enough. Ezra's breath left him in a whisper. There you are, he murmured. You're still here. Orion, lying beside the pup, lifted her head. Her ears perked, and her eyes, golden, alert, met his. She had not left her child's side, not even for food or water. Her body remained thin, her paw swollen, but her gaze held something new. Not desperation, not fear. Recognition. Ezra reached out and gently ran a finger along the puppy's back. It was warmer now, wrapped in towels that had absorbed the heat of the fire all night. The puppy responded with another faint whimper and shifted slightly, pressing instinctively toward its mother's scent. "You made it," Ezra said softly. And then, as if the name had been waiting all along, he added, "Nova, that's your name now." Orion blinked slowly, and Ezra could have sworn her tail flicked once in agreement. From the kitchen, the clatter of metal signaled Maeve Santiago's return. She stepped into the room carrying a bowl of warm rice and boiled chicken, a makeshift meal for Orion. She wore an oversized flannel jacket over her hoodie, a tangle of dark curls escaping her knit beanie, and a set of clear glasses that slid down her nose when she bent over. There was always a quiet steadiness about Maeve, a mix of empathy and precision that made her seem older than her 23 years. She placed the bowl gently on the floor near Orion and stepped back. "That should be gentle enough for her stomach," she said, then smiled faintly. "Looks like Nova's still fighting." Ezra nodded. "She cried. Twice. Just now." "Good sign," Maeve said. "It means her brain activity is still normal. Her chances are going up." She hesitated before pulling a tablet from her bag. "There's something else I've been digging into while you were watching her. The chip we scanned last night. It led me somewhere familiar." Ezra looked up, brows furrowing. Maeve knelt near the fire, her expression shifting into something more guarded. "There's a name that keeps coming up in reports tied to unregistered kennels and breeding operations around Havenport. I remembered it because my mentor flagged him 2 years ago, but the investigation went nowhere." She turned the tablet to show Ezra a document. "Clive Denham, owner of a pet supply franchise called Denham Animal Essentials. Looks clean on paper, but dig a little deeper, and you'll find several complaints of animal mistreatment, fake adoption records, and illegal transport of live animals." Ezra leaned forward. The photo showed a man in his early 50s, square-jawed with thinning blonde hair and cold, pale eyes. "This is the guy?" "Yeah," Maeve said. "Clive was investigated by the local animal welfare task force a while back. Problem is, the warehouse they suspected was empty by the time officers arrived. Dogs were gone, no microchip data, no legal ownership records, no trace of abuse. He got away on a technicality." She paused. "But Orion's chip is still active, and if we can prove she was bred there, if we can link her directly, we might finally have something." Ezra stared at the flickering flame. The thought of Orion living in a place like that, birthed for profit, discarded when no longer useful, made something old and cold in him stir. "She's the only witness," he said quietly. "She is," Maeve replied, "but we'll need more than that. Photos, medical records, testimonies. And if Clive's looking for her, we have to move carefully." Ezra glanced toward Orion. She was sniffing the bowl cautiously, her stomach clearly torn between hunger and fear. Then, slowly, she lowered her head and took a bite. "That's the first time she's eaten since coming here," Ezra said, stunned. Maeve smiled. "That's trust." As if to confirm it, Orion stood shakily and walked to where Ezra sat. She lowered her head, and in a gesture both simple and monumental, she licked his hand. Ezra didn't move. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The world had been cruel to this creature, and yet, here she was, giving him a piece of herself he hadn't earned, but desperately needed. Outside, the sun had risen over Havenport, though the snow still clung stubbornly to rooftops and cars. Across the street, the curtains shifted in an upstairs apartment. Frank Delaney, Ezra's neighbor, watched from behind the blinds. A retired Air Force medic in his 70s, Frank was known around the building for his no-nonsense attitude and suspicious glare. Tall and stoop-shouldered with a crisp mustache and thick wool cardigan, he rarely engaged unless spoken to, but nothing in the neighborhood escaped him. He'd seen Maeve arrive last night, heard fragments of phone calls, and now he watched the dog, the one he'd seen limp across the courtyard 2 nights ago, sitting beside Ezra like she'd lived there all her life. Frank narrowed his eyes. Something was going on in 1B. Downstairs, Maeve was packing up. "I've got class in an hour, but I'll check back this evening. Can you monitor Nova's breathing and keep her warm, and see if she tries to nurse?" Ezra nodded. "I'll stay with her." Maeve hesitated at the door. "Ezra?" "Thank you." Not many people would have opened the door. He didn't answer, but she saw the way his hand lingered on Orion's head. That was answer enough. When she was gone, Ezra sat in the quiet again, though it no longer felt as heavy. He watched Nova sleep and Orion breathe, and he whispered under his breath, "You're safe here." But beyond the apartment, in a parking lot near Briar Avenue, a dark sedan idled with the engine running. A man in a black coat held a tablet on his lap. The signal had gone faint again, but the trace was enough. Clive Denham stared at the address that glowed on his screen and narrowed his eyes. "Found you," he muttered. By mid-morning, the storm had finally exhausted itself. The city of Havenport stirred beneath the frost, rooftops sparkling under weak winter sunlight, and icicles drooping like frozen chandeliers from balcony rails and power lines. Apartment 1B, once shadowed by silence, now hummed with quiet movement. Ezra Callan stood in the small entryway, fastening the last button of his olive-green coat. His gloved hands were careful as he adjusted the leash on Orion's collar, a simple blue strap Maeve had dropped off that morning. Orion shifted slightly, her amber eyes scanning the hallway with the wary grace of a soldier returning to a battlefield. Her paw was still tender, but she had begun to walk with steadier footing. This was her first time outside since she arrived. Ezra himself looked changed. Though the grief still etched fine lines around his eyes, he moved now with purpose. There was weight in his step, even if his limp remained. A scarf was wrapped around his neck, not just for the cold, but perhaps as a small gesture of reintegration with the world beyond his door. They stepped into the courtyard, a shared space behind the apartment building, enclosed by chain-link fence and a border of leafless hedges. The snow here was untouched, save for faint paw prints from squirrels or strays. Ezra let Orion lead. Her nose twitched, ears rotated at every distant sound. A car passing, a door closing. Yet her stance was no longer desperate. She walked beside him, not ahead or behind. Ezra's thoughts drifted as they moved. Maeve had sent him an email late the previous night with a list of animal rights organizations interested in her findings. She had already begun drafting a preliminary report with photos of Orion's scars and medical scans of Nova. Ezra, unfamiliar with activism or court proceedings, had simply typed back, "Tell me where to be and when. I'll be there." But just as Orion paused to sniff at a half-buried tennis ball, Ezra noticed something. At the far end of the courtyard, near the dumpster enclosure, a shape was watching them. Still, tense, half-shadowed by a skeletal bush. It was a dog. Bigger than Orion by a good 10 pounds, with thick fur matted by dirt and old blood. One of its ears was torn at the edge. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, yellow-brown and intense. Scars crisscrossed its flank, and its ribs were visible under the shaggy black coat. This was not a stray accustomed to begging. It was a survivor. Ezra instinctively stopped. Orion did the same, but she didn't retreat. Instead, her body shifted forward, placing herself subtly between Ezra and the unknown dog, her shoulders squared, ears forward. Not threatening, but protective. The two stared at each other in silence. Ezra could feel the tension strumming through the leash. Then, with a slow, cautious step, the stray advanced. Ezra didn't move, but his heart quickened. "Easy," he murmured to Orion, though his eyes stayed on the newcomer. "We don't want trouble." The stray paused, sniffed the air, its head tilted slightly as if weighing its options. Orion let out a low growl, quiet but firm. Then the moment broke. The stray turned its head sharply, as if something in the alley behind the dumpsters had startled it, and bolted, disappearing behind the hedge and vanishing like smoke. Ezra exhaled. "What the hell was that?" From behind them, a voice grunted, "That one's been around a while." Ezra turned to see Frank Delaney leaning against the back door frame of the building, a steaming mug of coffee in his gloved hands. Frank wore a thick wool cardigan buttoned over a flannel shirt and khaki trousers tucked into snow boots. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his eyes, small, sharp, missed little. He looked like someone who'd seen war and still ironed his shirts. Ezra offered a nod. "Morning." Frank took a slow sip of his drink before stepping into the snow. "You've seen him before, right? That brute?" "First time," Ezra said. "Looked scarred up." Frank nodded. Name's Ash. Well, I call him that. Been skulking around this block for months. Doesn't let anyone near him. Bit a teenager who tried to pet him last fall. Nearly took a chunk out of my thigh last spring when I was taking out the trash. But never really attacks unless cornered. His tone held no resentment, just observation. Ezra glanced in the direction Ash had gone. He didn't look like a street dog. No, he didn't, Frank said. That's the thing. Looks more like a dog that used to belong to someone, then got left behind or worse. He squatted beside Orion, who now sat calmly between the two men. This one's got a strong presence. You can tell she's a protector. She is, Ezra said. Her name's Orion. Frank looked at him sideways. You're not much of a talker, but you've got taste. Ezra smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. Frank stood again. If that Ash fellow comes back, and he will, you might want to be careful. He's fast and cagey. Might be scared of you now, but fear makes desperate things do foolish stuff. Orion nudged Ezra's hand with her nose, and he gave her a brief scratch behind the ear. You got a good one, Frank said, turning back to his door. And from the looks of it, she thinks the same about you. Ezra watched the older man disappear inside, then looked again to where Ash had stood moments earlier. The eyes. That was what haunted him. The way Ash had looked at them. Not with hunger or aggression, but something deeper. Something bruised. Ezra had seen that look before. It had been in Orion's eyes the night she arrived. Later, back inside the apartment, Ezra fed Orion small bits of warm food while Nova lay curled in a towel-lined basket beside the radiator. The puppy was still weak, but her limbs twitched now in sleep, her ears occasionally fluttering, as if catching echoes of a safer world. Ezra caught his reflection in the window, his face fuller somehow. The lines softened. He glanced down at Orion, who had finished her meal and was licking Nova gently between the ears. You saw something in him, Ezra murmured, didn't you? She looked up at him. He was like you once. Orion didn't reply, but she rested her head on his foot, and in the stillness of that moment, Ezra understood. Not all scars were visible, and not all strays were lost. The cold returned like a ghost that had forgotten to knock. By nightfall, Havenport was cloaked once more in ice and wind, and the city groaned under its breath. It wasn't the kind of storm that painted streets in postcard snow. It was sharp, sudden, and vengeful, turning window panes to thin frost and sidewalks to cracking glass. Inside apartment 1B, the fire had burned steady for hours, but it couldn't fully hold back the creeping chill that snuck through the cracks. Ezra Callan sat by the hearth, cradling a bundle of blankets that held the fragile form of Nova, whose tiny body trembled in irregular pulses. At first he thought she was dreaming, paws twitching, a muffled sound escaping her throat. But when the trembling didn't stop, and her breathing grew short and erratic, a panic rose in Ezra's chest that was both ancient and freshly torn. He set her down gently on the floor cushion and watched in horror as a small spasm jerked her limbs. It wasn't violent, just enough to be unmistakable, a seizure, small but real. Nova, he whispered, already pulling the blanket tighter around her. Stay with me. His hands, usually steady, now shook as he checked her nose, her gums, the softness of her belly. She was cold, too cold. Despite the fire, her tiny frame had begun to lose its fight against the drop in temperature. Across the room, Orion stood, hackles raised, her eyes dark with instinct. She let out a low growl, not at Ezra, but at the air, at the sudden shift in energy that set her fur bristling. Then, unexpectedly, she threw back her head and released a long, mournful howl. The sound echoed through the apartment like a siren from another time, raw and guttural, laced with sorrow and something deeper. It was the first sound she had made since arriving. Ezra froze. The room seemed to still itself around that sound. Nova twitched again. Ezra leaned in, scooping her up once more, bringing her close to his chest, his heartbeat frantic beneath his flannel. No, he murmured, not tonight, not now. The fire snapped, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. He rocked back and forth, holding Nova close, his face buried into the folds of the towel. The room blurred around him. Memory surged. It had been a hospital room, white, too white, and sterile. Machines humming their empty rhythm. His daughter, Emma, 8 years old, with dark curls and eyes too big for her tiny frame, a high fever, an infection they caught too late. She had shivered like this too, one hand gripping his while the other grew limp. He had begged then too, whispered words into her ear while the world slipped sideways. But he'd been too late. Not again. "Please," he whispered into Nova's damp fur. "Please, little one." Orion had laid herself at Ezra's side, her front paw resting gently on his knee. Her presence was firm, grounding. Together they watched the trembling subside, slowly, incrementally, until Nova's spasms softened into mere shivers. Ezra moved quickly. He fetched a hot water bottle, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it beside Nova's body beneath the blanket. He adjusted the distance from the fire, careful not to overheat her. Then he stayed there, sitting on the wooden floor like a watchman at the edge of a battlefield. It was after midnight when she stirred, just a soft sigh, almost inaudible. Ezra's head had begun to droop when he felt it, the pressure of tiny paws against his forearm. He looked down. Nova was moving, sluggish and weak, but alive. Relief crashed into him like a wave. He bent his head, one hand cradling the back of her neck. "That's it," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. "You're not going anywhere." Orion licked Nova's ear once, then laid her head on Ezra's lap and exhaled. Across town, under the cover of the blackest part of night, a van sat idling near the corner of Briar and 18th. The man in the passenger seat wore a navy blue uniform with a stitched-on patch, Havenport Power and Light. His name was Lucas Reed, mid-30s, wiry frame, short black beard, eyes always scanning. He'd once been a real electrician, but now he worked for cash, and for people like Clive Denham, who paid well enough to buy silence. "Apartment complex is just down there," said Lucas, pointing with a gloved hand. 3 floors, looks old. Might have external fuse access." Clive, seated beside him in a wool coat too fine for the cold, didn't look at the building. His attention was on the tracker tablet in his hand, which displayed a familiar pulse, faint but constant. "She's in there, I know it." "You want me to pose as utility inspection?" Lucas asked. "Tomorrow," Clive muttered. "Too much risk tonight. Cold like this draws attention, but we'll need eyes inside. Knock on a few doors, say we're checking for grid overload. Ask about pets, concerns for the wiring, that kind of thing." Lucas nodded. "You want her back alive?" Clive's expression didn't change. "I want her gone. That chip can't fall into the wrong hands. If she's with the pup, they both go." Lucas glanced at the building again, then back at the flickering pulse on the screen. "Right. I'll be subtle." Clive exhaled, breath fogging the windshield. "Do that, and make sure no one sees you." Back in apartment 1B, Ezra remained in place through the early hours. He didn't sleep. He kept adjusting the heat packs, checking Nova's breathing, whispering encouragement in the dark. Orion never left his side. The fire burned lower, but it was enough. By dawn, when the sun finally broke across the snow-covered rooftops and spilled gold into the room, Nova was resting calmly. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm that no longer seemed borrowed. Ezra leaned back against the wall, exhausted, but didn't dare close his eyes. He had made a promise. This time, he wouldn't fail. The sun hung low above Havenport like a pale coin, more suggestion than warmth, as it cast long shadows across the slush-filled sidewalks and brittle grass of late winter. The air held that particular stillness only found in early afternoon, neither the quiet of dawn nor the bustle of evening. For Ezra Callan, it was the kind of day that demanded resolve, the kind where you made promises to yourself and hoped you'd be strong enough to keep them. He stood at the threshold of apartment 1B, tugging gently at Orion's leash. The German shepherd moved beside him without resistance, no longer limping as sharply as before. Her coat, once ragged with ice and blood, had begun to regain a healthy sheen. Her gait had a soldier's steadiness. Orion glanced up at Ezra as if asking, "Are you sure about this?" Ezra gave her a small nod. Nova was resting comfortably now in her blanket nest near the heater, her breathing steady and unlabored. Ezra had left a small bowl of soft food and warm water beside her. Orion had hesitated to leave her, but Ezra had promised, just for a little while. They were headed to the old park, just 4 blocks east. Meridian Hollow, once a community favorite, now partially abandoned after years of failed funding and a few well-publicized late-night crimes. But more importantly, It had once been used as a drop point for illegal animal transactions. Places where crates changed hands, money passed in silence, and animals like Orion disappeared into silence. It was Maeve who had the idea. She had arrived earlier that morning with a large green backpack and a fire in her eyes. Dressed in a patched army jacket and wool-lined boots, she looked far younger than her resolve suggested. She'd only just turned 24, but in her stance, in the way she surveyed the street, she seemed like someone who had carried more than one life on her shoulders. "We can't wait for Clive to make the next move," Maeve had said, placing a small camera the size of a pen into Ezra's hand. "We take the initiative. He's looking for her, right? So we put her where she'll be seen, carefully of course, and we watch who comes sniffing around." "You're talking about bait," Ezra replied, his voice unreadable. Maeve's jaw tightened. "I'm talking about setting a trap. You in?" Ezra had looked at Orion, then at the fire still burning in the hearth. He thought about the first night, the frost on her fur, the dying weight of Nova in his hands, and then he said, "Yes." Now, as they reached the edge of Meridian Hollow, Ezra scanned the surroundings with cautious eyes. Maeve had arrived 10 minutes earlier and positioned herself across the street on a rooftop ledge overlooking the main path. She had her camera, her phone, and a thermos of black coffee. Her breath formed small puffs in the air as she whispered into her mic, "You're clear. Just walk the perimeter." Ezra entered the park with Orion at his side, their feet crunching on frozen dirt. Old playground equipment stood like forgotten skeletons on the far side of the field, and a rusted picnic table sat buried in a drift of snow. They walked slowly, heading toward the covered footbridge where most of the reported dog trades had taken place. Orion's ears perked. Ezra felt it too. An unease, faint but real. A figure was moving near the back of the park, approaching with casual strides. A man, mid-40s, average height, wiry build. He wore a black parka, faded jeans, and a knit cap pulled low over his forehead. In his hand was a leash, but there was no dog on the other end. Maeve's voice crackled in Ezra's ear through the hidden mic. "That's not one of mine. I don't recognize him." The man called out, smiling a little too wide. "Hey there, nice shepherd you've got." Ezra said nothing, kept walking. "You breeding her?" the man asked, stepping onto the path ahead of them. "She's got a strong frame. Looks like good stock." Ezra's grip tightened on the leash. Orion had gone still. The man came a step closer. "Mind if I take a look? Just a second?" That was when Orion growled, a deep primal sound that came from somewhere beyond language. Her body shifted, blocking Ezra instinctively. Her hackles bristled, tail low, but stiff. The man froze. Maeve whispered, "I'm recording. Keep him talking." Ezra met the stranger's eyes. "You should go." The smile dropped. "That's so?" "Yeah," Ezra said calmly. "She's not for sale, and neither am I." The man's gaze flicked to Orion, then to Ezra's chest, likely noticing the faint bulge of the camera pen clipped to his coat. Without a word, the man backed away slowly, then turned and walked quickly toward the rear exit of the park. He didn't look back. Maeve's voice snapped through the comm, urgent. "I got him. Full face, profile, voice. I'll enhance the video tonight and compare it to the list of Clive's known associates." Ezra exhaled. Orion was still stiff, but she glanced up at him with a kind of quiet readiness, as if to say, "I was ready for worse." Back home, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, Ash appeared again, just before dinner, standing near the trash bins at the edge of the alley behind the building. Ezra saw him through the kitchen window. This time, he didn't run. Ezra stepped out with a bowl of food, moving slowly. He didn't speak. He simply set the bowl down and took a few steps back. Ash, his black coat now dusted with clean snow, hesitated, then approached. He sniffed the bowl, then began to eat, his movements cautious but no longer frantic. Ezra stayed where he was until Ash finished. The dog raised his scarred head once, met Ezra's eyes, then turned and walked a few paces. And then, in a gesture Ezra hadn't expected, Ash laid down, not far but not hidden, facing the apartment, body low to the ground but watching, waiting. Inside, Nova whimpered for dinner, her tail thumping weakly against the floor. Orion, now back inside and stretched beside her, licked her daughter's ear once before closing her eyes. Ezra looked down at them, then out the window again toward Ash, who had curled in the shadows near the back step. Something quiet had shifted in the world. And somewhere in the distance, in a cold apartment filled with flickering monitors and faint signals, Clive Denham watched the GPS trace grow weaker. He didn't know what was happening, but something was changing. The snow had begun to melt in Havenport, slowly, reluctantly. Dirty slush collected along the edges of sidewalks and ran in narrow rivulets down the gutters. It was the kind of thaw that revealed what had been hidden: cigarette butts buried in ice, forgotten toys trapped in frost, and, in the case of a warehouse on the south edge of the city, something far worse. Ezra stood in the doorway of apartment 1B, Orion at his side, watching as Maeve's car disappeared down the street. She was on her way to the police station, carrying the footage they'd captured at the old park, along with a file she'd been quietly building for weeks. Inside were medical records, chip tracking data, timestamps from camera footage, and photos. So many photos of injuries, scars, and evidence only someone who loved animals would bother to collect. Maeve had been calm that morning, but Ezra knew her well enough now to recognize the tightness in her voice, the tension in her shoulders. "Today's the day," she'd said. Not to him, but to herself. And Ezra, who had once thought himself too broken to believe in justice, found himself hoping. 3 hours later, the news came. A convoy of 2 police vans and 3 unmarked sedans had descended on the Denham Animal Supply Distribution Center, a gray warehouse tucked behind a row of abandoned car dealerships. The police had a warrant, activated under new animal welfare legislation Maeve had helped them navigate. The location matched the GPS coordinates from Orion's microchip history and, according to the most recent tracker ping, had just barely gone dark the night before. But it was still enough. Inside, they found rows of cages, many empty, some not. Dogs of all breeds, most underfed, some injured, barked and whimpered as officers moved through the aisles. In the back, behind a false wall disguised as storage shelving, they found the real operation, lined with breeding stalls, medical restraints, and a freezer. Clive Denham had been inside, pacing near his desk, phone in hand. He didn't resist, but his expression was venomous, as if the world had betrayed him, not the other way around. Back at the apartment, Ezra watched the news from the armchair. Nova curled at his feet and Orion resting with her head on the cushion beside him. The local station had blurred the worst of the footage, but even the sanitized version showed enough. Cages stacked like coffins, workers in hazmat suits removing animals, and Clive, face twisted with arrogance, being led in cuffs past the cameras. Orion raised her head when she saw the image, and Ezra could feel the muscles in her body tense beneath his hand. She watched for several seconds, then looked away, burying her nose in Nova's fur, as if to close a chapter only she had ever fully lived. That evening, the apartment had unexpected visitors. The first was Detective Helena Briggs, lead officer on the Denham case. She was in her early 50s, with short-cropped gray hair and a posture that said she didn't suffer liars. Her frame was solid, her boots worn, and her coat bore the unmistakable scent of rain and cigarettes. When Ezra opened the door, she didn't offer her badge, just her hand. "Mr. Callan," she said, "I've heard a lot about you." "Mostly good?" he asked, managing half a smile. She smirked. "Mostly heroic. May I come in?" Briggs stayed only 20 minutes, long enough to confirm Orion's identification through veterinary records, scan the updated chip again, and get Ezra's signature on a voluntary witness statement. She squatted beside Orion before leaving, scratching gently behind the dog's ears. "You did good, girl," she said. "You saved a lot of lives." The second visitor arrived just before sunset. Ezra had been preparing Nova's dinner when he heard the knock, soft but persistent. Opening the door, he found Frank Delaney standing there, wrapped in his usual cardigan and scarf, a plain envelope in one hand. Frank looked hesitant, for once not sharp-edged. "Got a minute?" "Always," Ezra said. Frank stepped inside and stood near the window, glancing out toward the alley. Ash wasn't there, but his presence lingered in the half-eaten bowl near the steps. Frank cleared his throat. "I wrote something, for the shelter. Thought maybe you'd, I don't know, read it?" Ezra took the envelope and slid out the letter inside. The handwriting was neat, formal, a little shaky. "To whom it may concern," it began, "I, Frank Delaney, would like to submit a formal application to adopt the stray German shepherd known locally as Ash. I am a retired military medic, experienced in canine care under extreme conditions. And though I've made my share of mistakes, I believe I can offer this dog something neither of us has had in a long time: a second chance." Ezra finished the letter and looked up. Frank was staring at the floor. "I lost a dog," Frank said, "years ago, in Kandahar. We were ambushed. I froze. He didn't. Took the bullet for me." His voice didn't waver, but his eyes were glassy. "Never forgave myself." Ezra folded the letter and handed it back. "He'd forgive you. Ash will too." Frank didn't speak, but he gave a short nod, turned, and left. 2 days later, Maeve returned, this time not in jeans and boots, but in a pressed navy blouse and slacks, her hair pulled into a ponytail. She carried a slim folder and a smile she was trying to suppress. "I have news," she said. Ezra stepped aside, letting her in. "Let me guess, your secret identity as a superhero has been exposed." Maeve grinned. "Close. I've been offered a full-time position as assistant program director at the Havenport Rescue and Rehabilitation Center." Ezra blinked. That's big." She sat beside Orion, resting a hand on the dog's back. "It's because of her. And Nova. And you." She paused. "We're going to expand, take in more abused rescues, provide training, rehoming. We'll even have an outreach program, teach kids about compassion." Ezra didn't answer right away. He looked down at Nova, now chewing on a soft plush toy. Her tail wagged lazily. A few weeks ago, she hadn't been expected to live. "I want to help," he said finally, "however I can." Maeve's face softened. "Then let's start something good. From the ashes." As if on cue, a bark sounded from the alley. Ezra opened the back door. Ash stood there, tail still, ears forward. Behind him, Frank approached, leash in hand. "Figured I'd try the collar today," he muttered. "No promises." Ezra stepped aside. "He's yours now." Frank clipped the leash slowly, cautiously. Ash didn't flinch. Inside, Orion sat up and looked toward the door. Ezra watched as she met Ash's eyes. No growl, no posturing, just recognition. The past, seeing itself in the present and moving on. Spring arrived in Havenport, not with fanfare, but with softness. The kind that slipped between buildings on warm breezes and nudged crocuses up from cracked sidewalks. The trees along Briar Avenue bloomed in hesitant bursts of white and pale green, and the last of the winter's bitterness melted into puddles that reflected a sky bluer than Ezra Callan had remembered in years. The apartment at 1B had changed too. The windows were open now, letting in birdsong and sun. The curtains swayed gently, and the smell of freshly ground coffee mingled with the unmistakable scent of dog fur and cedar wood. In the middle of the living room, sprawled across a patchwork rug, Nova rolled onto her back with her paws flailing toward the ceiling. Her body, once barely surviving, had grown lean and strong. Her fur was a healthy blend of deep sable and caramel, and her ears now stood tall with curiosity. At 5 months old, she was still clumsy, but her eyes, gold-flecked like Orion's, carried a light that hadn't existed when she arrived. Orion lay nearby, ever watchful. Her coat had regained its sheen, and though her scars would never fade completely, they no longer defined her. She had filled out. Her muscles taut and posture regal. Yet, in Ezra's presence, she softened, wagging her tail in small, silent arcs every time he entered the room. Ash was stretched out on the back porch, tongue lolling, basking in the midday warmth. The transformation in him was nothing short of astonishing. Weeks of steady meals and quiet patience had rebuilt his frame. His once dull coat now gleamed black under the sun, and the haunted look in his eyes had begun to dissolve into something closer to peace. He no longer flinched at sudden movements. He no longer ran. Frank Delaney sat beside him, reading the newspaper aloud in a dry, unimpressed tone. City Council still arguing about pothole funding. Meanwhile, the squirrels are forming governments in the park. Frank, dressed in his usual cardigan and army cap, looked older now, but not tired, just real. His days were now measured in bowls filled, walks taken, and how many times Ash would nudge him for another ear scratch. The letter he'd sent to the shelter had been framed and now sat on his mantelpiece, right beside a black and white photo of his old military dog, Rex. Ezra stood in the small community garden behind the apartment complex, where a dozen neighbors had gathered under paper lanterns and string lights. The patch of earth had once been little more than weeds and broken fencing, but in the weeks following Clive Denham's arrest, it had become something more. People had begun to talk again, to gather, to bring their dogs and coffee and stories. Today, Ezra had invited them for something simple, but meaningful, a ceremony of names. Maeve stood beside him, beaming, a clipboard tucked under one arm and a leash in the other. She wore a yellow sundress beneath a denim jacket, her curls bouncing as she moved. Her new job at the Havenport Rescue and Rehabilitation Center had transformed her life. She had purpose, yes, but more importantly, she had community. Ezra cleared his throat. "Thanks for coming," he said. His voice still had that soft gravel to it, but it no longer sounded like it was carrying too much alone. "A few months ago, I didn't think I had much left to say. I thought silence was safer. I thought it was easier. Then, they came." He gestured to Orion sitting calmly beside him with Nova at her side. "This is Orion," he continued. "She showed up on my doorstep carrying her half-frozen pup in her mouth. She saved Nova before I ever did. She's brave, loyal, and fierce. She protected others even when she was the one who needed saving. Her tag reads, The Guardian." A few neighbors clapped. Someone wiped away a tear. Orion dipped her head slightly, as if accepting a title that had long belonged to her. Ezra bent down and picked up Nova, now wriggling with excitement. "And this is Nova, her daughter. We didn't think she'd survive that first night, but she did. She kept fighting, and now she runs circles around us all. She's joy incarnate. Her tag reads, The Hope." Nova barked once, triumphant. Ezra then turned to Ash, who stood calmly beside Frank. "And this," he said, voice thickening just slightly, "is Ash. Once a ghost in our alley. A dog who didn't trust hands, who lived like shadows live. But he came back, every night. And one day, he stayed. He belongs to Frank now, but really, he belongs to all of us. His tag reads, The Redemption." The crowd was silent for a beat before applause broke, gentle and sincere. Frank scratched Ash's ear. "He's still a lousy chess partner," he muttered, which made a ripple of laughter spread. After the tags were fastened, sleek silver ovals with etched names and meanings, Ezra sat on the bench and watched Nova chase a ball around the garden, her legs too long for her body, Orion watching her like a hawk with a mother's patience. Maeve sat beside Ezra and handed him a small cup of lemonade. "You did good," she said. Ezra smiled, faint and real. They did good. Around them, neighbors lingered. Someone brought out a radio, playing soft jazz. Children tossed sticks for their dogs. The small garden, once forgotten, now bloomed. Not just with tulips and lilies, but with conversation, with warmth, with belonging. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the lanterns had been unplugged, Ezra sat on the back steps. Orion was curled beside him, Nova asleep between her paws. Ash lay under Frank's bench, his breathing steady and deep. Ezra looked out at the stars, then down at the dogs that had somehow saved him when he didn't know he needed saving. And in the stillness, he said aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the night itself, "People say we rescue dogs, but really, they rescue us." Orion shifted in her sleep, leaning against his leg. Nova sighed contentedly. Ash snored, and spring, gentle and slow, stayed. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with trumpets or lightning from the sky. Sometimes, they come wrapped in fur, with a limp, a scar, or a silent plea scratched against a stranger's door. This story of Ezra, Orion, Nova, and Ash is more than just about dogs and a man who had forgotten how to feel. It's about what happens when we choose compassion over comfort, when we open the door not knowing who or what we might find. It's about how God moves quietly among us, not always in churches or cathedrals, but in alleyways, in frozen courtyards, and in the broken hearts of both people and animals longing to be seen. Because when we say, "God, send me someone," He may send a wounded dog. And when we say, "God, please heal me," He may send a puppy too weak to lift her head, so that in healing her, we are healed ourselves. And so, dear friend, if you've ever felt forgotten, or too old to start again, or too wounded to be useful, remember this: God does not waste pain. Every scar is a map, every heartbreak a door. And sometimes, in the most unexpected season, spring stays. Now, it's your turn. If this story touched your heart, don't let it stop here. Please leave a comment sharing your own miracle, or the name of a beloved animal who once saved you. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of redemption and grace. And finally, may God bless you and your household. May He send you your own Orion when you need her most. And may you never forget, whoever rescues the least of these rescues me. Matthew. God bless, and see you in the next story.